Welcome back to the Secrets of the Scrolls, Episode 5, an Elder Scrolls Legends podcast. I'm joined this week by Ancient Silence, and we're going to talk about a really interesting set of topics this week. We are going to talk about archetypes, the different types, what decks slot into this within Legends. We're going to talk about that nasty bug that is going around the ladder. I'm going to say it right now. Season 1 of the ladder, there's a big shiny asterisk next to it. We'll see if Ancient Silence agrees with me. We're going to talk about Control Mage. This seems to be not the flavor of the month, because that's not how it works in this game. It's the flavor of the last 3 days or so. But why is it good? Is there a budget version that you can build if you don't have a lot of cards yet? And what beats this nasty mage deck? Then we're going to go over the recent nerfs that have happened. And post-nerfs, where does Archer sit in the metagame? What does Archer look like now? So let's go ahead and get into it. And I'd like to welcome Ancient Silence. Welcome to the show, man. How you doing?
Hey man, I'm doing great, Tony. Thanks for having me on, man. Really appreciate it.
No problem. And I didn't get to this yet, but Ancient Silence is the newest member of Team Prophecy. So welcome, sir. Hopefully you will help lead us to even greater and loftier heights within the Legends community.
Thanks a lot, man. I look forward tremendously to working with the guys in the team. A lot of talented guys there, interesting personalities. Fun times ahead.
Yeah, that's what I like best about our team. It's not just a team that's like, okay, we practice 20 hours a day and we're all boring. Like I feel like we got a good group of people that they're having fun with the game and doing interesting things. All right, Ancient Silence. Before we get rolling, though, what brings you to Legends? First of all, how long have you been playing?
Well, I got in with the last wave of closed beta players, so probably in the last 3 days of what, July?
Mm-hmm. Sounds like everyone I know. We all got in the same day. That's cool. Next question, I guess, is how's your collection coming along? Do you have a full collection or a full-ish collection to where you feel like, oh, here's a deck I want to build, boom, I can build it?
Definitely not. I have I have a bit of a history in playing card games, and what I tend to do in the beginning is I DE things like crazy to build the kind of lists that I like playing, and then I set myself a goal every month to sort of flesh out 2 more top tier lists, and then go from there. So, you have to make some sacrifices up front.
Okay, that's fair. Have you bought any packs then, or are you pretty much entirely free to play at this point?
I've spent about 30 euros, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, about 30, and I'll probably spend more.
Okay. I was just curious. Yeah, it's funny because I've spent a lot more than that, and I still feel like I'm in that exact same boat where it's like I now have one meta deck that I think is really strong, the Control Mage. I'm actually really close on the Moneybag Scout deck. I got lucky, man, the other day. I got my 3rd win of the day. Iron Atronach in the pack. I couldn't believe it.
Oh,
Almost lost my
feels
mind.
good, man.
I know. I was so happy because, especially with the packs that I've opened, have been so bad. I've had to craft like every good legendary I have. It was a great moment.
Sounds like you have the same pack opening luck as I do.
Oh my goodness, it's the worst. It is the worst. If you want to see bad pack opening luck, people go to my YouTube channel. Check it out. They're always bad. They're always bad. If you like hilariously bad, I'm the dude to watch. If you want to see great packs, don't come my way.
I heard Delude is pretty good at opening good packs.
Oh, yeah,
So.
he is phenomenal at it. So, question for you then. What is your experience in card games? I'm going to have to make this crazy assumption that you didn't jump into Legends and it was your first card game ever and you were like, hey, I'm great at this miraculously. So where'd you come from?
I've been playing card games and strategy games my whole life, pretty much. I grew up playing Magic the Gathering, and then when Hearthstone came out, I basically joined that game in beta and played that for about 2 years, a little more than 2 years. And then last year, I think in November, I had just had it with Hearthstone, and a new game had just come out that married my love of chess and card games together, Duelist. So I started playing that, and I've been playing that on a high level, basically since beta there.
Nice.
And I still play. Yeah.
So would you consider yourself still a like top-notch duelist player that's sort of checking out Legends and trying to decide if you want to make a jump, or are you planning to try to do the impossible and the unthinkable and juggle 2 games at once and be a high-level player in both?
To be honest, I think that at some point you have to commit to one, at least more seriously than the other. And based off of my experience with Legends so far, I am leaning toward this being my main game, actually.
We got him. We got him, people. We got another one. We did it. We won the battle. Take that, Duelist. I played Duelist myself for a little bit, sort of for the same reasons. I was a tournament chess player at one point in my life, and it was really cool to be able to merge a board like that and all of the strategy that comes with it with a card game. While I have liked Duelist very much, I've said this a million times on my stream that I feel like we are living in the golden age of card games. If Duelist was the only card game available, I would play it and I would love it. But I like this one better, and I've liked other ones better, and it's made life difficult having so many great choices.
Yeah, absolutely. The cool thing about games like Duelist, for example, was that it has a bit of a unique angle to it. The board, I tend to actually think of it more as a board game with a bit of card game sort of mixed in.
Sure.
But because of Magic the Gathering and how much I just love card games, I mean, when Legends came out. And of course, I played Elder Scrolls games my whole life as well.
Oh, there you go.
That was just a natural fit.
Yeah, that's for sure. Yeah, but before we move on, then I want to say one thing that I wasn't planning on talking about, but that is the notion of trying to juggle 2 games. And I tried to do that at one point. I tried to juggle Game of Thrones living card game and the Star Wars living card game at the same time, and I was a very high-level player in both, but I definitely felt like in both games I was held back a little bit. Like, if you want to be the best player in a game, you have to be seeing things at such a level that you can't be distracted by another game that you're taking seriously. And I felt like trying to do both made it so that I was like top 10 in both, but I couldn't quite get higher than that, and I had to eventually drop one of them.
Yeah, that's what I mean by, eventually you have to commit.
Yeah. So
It doesn't mean you can't play the other one and even be quite good.
Yep.
And even competitive to a certain level. But, if you're aspiring to higher goals, committing is another way to go.
Yeah, it's brain space. Some people can do it, or they can just completely lock these parts of their brains and be fine. For me, it all kind of bleeds together. I get to points where I'm like, wait, how many cards do I draw a game? Is it 5 or 7? And my opponent's like, aren't you one of the best players in the world? And I'm like, I am. But just how many do you draw? And they're like, this is really weird. Are you sure you're one of the best players in the game? Because you don't seem like you have any clue what you're doing. All right. Well, let's move on then. And let's talk about archetypes. So this is not unique to Elder Scrolls Legends. Pretty much every card game, you're going to have the same types of archetypes. You usually have, aggressive decks. You have more mid-rangey decks, and you have more control-ish decks. So in Legends, what would you say is a good representation of an aggro deck, and what do we generally think of when we think of this term aggro decks?
I think at the moment there's still a lot of unexplored space for aggro lists. The ones we usually see are often based around red and some other color, mostly white, but then or yellow. And you also get the action mage lists, which are blue and white, or yellow, however you prefer. That are obviously trying to snowball an early advantage. But they are, as I say, they're not as refined yet, I think, in this game. But it's coming. It's coming.
I think it's interesting that you didn't list Battle Mage, because for me, when I think of just aggro, I think of like Battle Mage and throw a bunch of weapons on dudes and pray they don't get removed. Like, that's like as hardcore aggro as you can roll.
Yeah, Battle Mage is one that is worthy of a mention, I guess. I feel like it's so inconsistent at this point.
Oh, I
as
agree.
you say, you're hoping.
Yeah.
Please don't kill my minion, because then I'm going face. Face on.
I kind of feel like Battle Mage is like Face Hunter in Hearthstone, except for Hearthstone doesn't have a comeback mechanic in it. right? So it's like,
Right.
imagine Face Hunter where every time you hit your opponent, they were drawing cards and killing your guys off of the draw. The deck wouldn't work. And so that's
Exactly.
kind of what you have with Battle Mage is this interesting issue. And let's talk about that. It's so interesting how this game makes aggro decks much more difficult, I think, than in other games. And like we were talking about, the lists aren't that refined yet because I think the runes and the prophecy system make it much harder just to be like, okay, I'm just going to take damage, put it in a deck, and swing face. Like there's more nuance there, and I think it's harder to build an aggro list that's successful because it needs some sort of like more closing power, more sustainability than in other games where aggro is just simply I swing for 5 turns and I win or I lose.
Right. I mean, some aggro lists, they just kind of throw caution into the wind and go with that strategy anyway.
Yeah.
Everything goes face, and screw the prophecies. We're just gonna grind on through. If it gets a prophecy, well,
Right. Then we
can't
lose.
win them all.
And that happens.
But as you say, the prophecy system and the rune draw system, it really does. It asks different questions of you as an aggro deck builder.
Mm-hmm.
It's not as simple as just mindlessly swinging your face. You've got to have sustain, and that's why often red, right, which you would naturally think of as an aggro sort of attribute or color, because it has Jarl, right? So you can go face, and going face allows you to refuel and develop a 4/4 minion on 6, and then you're back in the game. It's answer me or die, and while you're dying, I'll draw some cards as well.
Yeah. And it has all kinds of buffs, and like the Steel Scimitar for 1, you can chuck on a guy with charge, and suddenly you're rolling for 5, right out of hand, and so you can have some closing power there. But you're right, I think Jarl really helps for sustain. Another deck that you didn't mention that I consider to be perhaps the best aggro deck right now is like a Spell Sword Tokens deck. And you can certainly build it to be more of a mid-game deck, but I've built mine to be more aggressive, where I'm really trying to take that board early, and then I have a little bit of closing power with like a Bone Colossus. But basically the deck is get that snowball-y effect to the point where they just can't recover. And if they're able to wipe your board, then you better draw a Bone Colossus and pray they can't wipe it again.
Yeah, I sort of think, I presume you're talking about Spellsword sort of token build, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I don't really think of Spellsword token as an aggro deck. It sure can feel like it when you play against it sometimes, when they get the early board and get a fervor out and then just snowball you. I think of it more as like a mid-range list that's more aggressive.
Okay, and I think that's fair, and I think you can build it either way also. You can build it to be a little more mid-rangey, or you can build it to be a little more aggressive. For me, I don't have some of the cards. So I don't have Black Marsh Warden, who I think pushes the deck to be a little bit more mid-rangey, and Tullius and these kind of cards. And so since I don't have them, I've sort of built my list to push harder early, and then when that inevitable board wipe comes, now I'm just hoping for like Bone Colossus into Warcry to finish out the game.
Right. Which I think they're it's not to be taken for granted. Spellsword Token is a decent list. No matter what variant of it you're going with, the more aggressive mid-rangey one, or the one that's aiming to go a little bit later. I think it's solid, and once again, there's so much unexplored terrain. I think it's good.
I do think it's fascinating that there are like a million versions of this list, and that's not even an exaggeration with all the permutations you can make. I've built at least 70 versions. and my current version, I don't even know if it's the best one, right? Like I have all these versions floating around, and I have mine open, and I'm like, I have one Dragontail Savior in this list? That can't be right. That just can't be right. So already I know this list needs more refinement. So it's such an interesting archetype, and like we've said, it can go in many different ways. And I have a video already about it, so we won't explore it more. But what would you consider to be sort of a prototypical mid-range deck?
Well, I mean, the premium mid-range deck, in my opinion, remains Archer.
Yeah, I assumed you were going to say that. I
It's
had the
just
deck open already before I asked you that question.
it is it is just so flexible in what it can do. Um, you know, new players may be fooled into thinking that it's a bit of a one-trick pony, relying on soul rests and yards for tempo, but
Hmm.
Archer is quite flexible, and even more so in the right hands. An experienced Archer player is a scary thing to behold.
Yeah.
For me, that's a classic mid-range deck.
There's so many
But there are,
pro plays to make in that deck. That's what's so cool about the deck. Like, it functions fine in a newer player's hands, and then every bit of experience you have with it, you go deeper and deeper and deeper, and you're like, okay, I can Earthbone Spinner that guy because I know the odds are good that I'm going to Leaf Lurker later, so I don't then have to trade him, and I can wait, and you just have all these next level plays you can make. It makes the deck really fun.
oh, absolutely. Like in the mirror, for example, right, where you sometimes make the decision to let's bone spinner a kinsman. You
Oh,
can't
yeah.
move it this turn, but from experience, the game plan here is we got to manage these HP totals.
Yep.
That's just a small example. So I think it's a relatively skill intensive deck, regardless of the people out there who have lost to it, and it can feel bad when you get steamrolled.
Yeah, I think it's the deck more than any other deck that people hop on the Discord channel and say, this deck is stupid. And when I see archers, I just resign instantly. And you're like, what? No, don't do that. Like, Soul Rest Marshall is good, yes, but he's not broken good. He's just good.
Yeah, it comes down, as with any matchup in any card game, nothing is unbeatable. It comes down to your knowledge of the matchup, understanding win conditions, and these things. So a newer player, when he faces a refined list and someone with experience, is probably going to feel like something really unfair has just happened to him.
Yeah,
But
for sure.
as you get more experience, you learn that there are ways to put Archer on the back foot and make them extremely uncomfortable. So
Yeah. And just to talk about this a bit more, what would you say makes Archer mid-range versus, an aggro deck we're talking about generally tries to push hard early? What are the cards that really define Archer as a mid-range deck, and what are the strategies that define it as a mid-range deck? Because I think some people can be kind of confused by this and say, well, they're looking to put all this early pressure on the board, then they slap down a Marshall as their closer card. That's an aggro deck. That's not a mid-range deck. What are you talking about? They beat me in 4 turns the other day.
it's a quality of a refined list, and often with mid-range lists, this has the potential to occur. If they get their early game rolling, they can very easily kind of pressure you down by mid-game. It's just over. Almost feel like you've been hit by a freight train. Almost as if it was an aggro list you were facing. But what makes Archer a mid-range list, in my opinion, is the versatility of its removal and its tempo plays in the mid-game that allow it to sustain just over that mid-game hump and close things out around sort of 6 to 8 mana. I think that's quite a characteristic of a mid-range list.
Yeah, I agree. I often think of mid-range as this. It has the flexibility to try to rush down control and outlast aggro. Whereas an aggro deck is just rushing down everything, right? It's not outlasting anything. If it goes late, it loses.
Right. I mean, despite despite what people may say, Archer is not an aggro deck.
Yeah.
You have to care about the board. You're caring about the board, but the tempo that you put on while dealing with the board gets you over just that mid-range hump in the middle of the game. That's what makes it a mid-range deck, and a damn strong one.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny because I played Control Mage for the last 2 weeks, I'd say, and when you're looking at it from a control perspective, Archer's an aggro deck, because that's the shift, right? When Archer plays against control, it goes fast, and the whole goal is to outlast that wily Archer deck, and when they triple Jarl you and get a little bit more sustain and beat you with their aggressive plays, you're like, oh.
Yeah.
All right, so what would you say is a prototypical control deck then?
Well, again, the premium control list in the game, in my opinion at least, I think it's it stands at least a foot or two ahead of any other control list is the control mage list and the variations of that list
Yeah.
at the moment. A list that looks to control the board, outvalue the opponent, and once you start grinding them out of cards, you start slamming big bombs at the end. Mage has all the tools.
Yeah, what makes it so fun to play is that you're playing this totally different game than an aggro deck. Like it's the complete polar opposite, right? The aggro deck is trying to kill you, and if they don't kill you fast enough, they throw their hands up and they lose. Whereas Control Mage is just trying to hold on until it reaches that breaking point, where then it just sits back and goes, "This is hilarious. Go ahead, play a card. Okay,
play
that's the
anything.
card. It's dead. It's dead. And here's 2 more bombs from me." It's just so fun to play if you like that kind of game plan. It can be frustrating playing Control because you get in those games where someone blitzes you down and you're just like, well, that seemed... It kind of can have a feels bad mentality to it, because when you get blitzed down, it feels very lucky, right? You're like, well, my opponent happened to have the nut draw and I didn't draw my removal, and it just kind of feels bad when that happens.
He perfect curved me, lucky guy. You know, it can, but I mean, it's as in, again, all card games have this where a control deck, you need to have good cycle. You need to, a better control player is really someone who understands what the decks that are popular in the metagame looks like. To play control efficiently means a very comprehensive understanding of the threats and win conditions of your opponent's decks in each particular matchup.
Yes, definitely. You need to know you don't have endless removal. It feels like it sometimes, but you don't. And so you really have to know this card is at the table. Is this something I need to remove? Is this part of a snowball? If you're playing Archer, Archer's such an interesting matchup because you have to look at your hand so carefully and say, can I contest the early game and stop the Martial Jarl combo?
Right.
And if not, you need to recognize that instantly and say, okay, then I'm not going to worry about that, and I'm only going to remove the high value threats. If you start removing everything hoping to combat that and don't have the tools to really do it, you're going to lose that game because you're going to use your removal too early, and then you won't have enough late. And so it makes it, for me, I know this is going to sound funny, and you might agree with this though, it feels more like a chess match when you play this. You have to really outthink your opponent and know what's happening, whereas aggro I feel like is much more of like, I drew cards and played them.
Well, you know, aggro decks if one takes away all the negative connotations, you know, at its core, what is an aggro list really trying to do? It's a list that says to you as its opponent, do you have the answer?
Yeah.
That's how those lists work. Do you have the answer?
Yep.
A control player is always, okay, he's going to ask questions, I better have the answer. So the better I know what I have to answer, the better this game is going to go for me. Yeah. But if you have 2 experienced players playing these different archetypes against each other, it becomes a very calculated back and forth.
Yeah.
One small mistake, and you can just lose a game.
Oh, yeah. That's one thing that a lot of people don't think about with aggro players. They think of it as play a card and swing. But aggro players, sometimes even more so than control players, have a smaller window for error. Like if you make one error as an aggro player, you often lose, because if you lose a damage, that could be the damage that lost you the game. Whereas when I play control mage, once the game gets to a certain breaking point, I can just play blind and it doesn't matter anymore. Like I can miss all the damage I want. It's like, whatever, the game's on lockdown. It took me 2 turns longer, but it was completely irrelevant. Whereas an aggro deck, I mean, you miss a damage, that might be game.
Yeah, there's also this, you know, common stigma that exists where playing aggro is considered, you know, by the majority as dishonorable, shameful. You know, but it isn't like that. If you think about it, it's just a different style of play. It likes to ask questions, and if you don't have the answers, you lose. It's just a different style.
Yeah, for sure. So, what would you say defines a control deck in Legends, and how does Control Mage sort of fit that definition?
Okay, so in this game, as in, again, quite a few other card games, a control archetype is one that has access to good removal and sustain and a clearly defined, powerful win condition in the late game. Control Mage, as an example, it has great removal because yellow has some of the best removal in the game, as does blue. And they fulfill different purposes. Some of the yellow removal is very expensive, some of the blue removal is cheap. And so you have removal options during various window periods in the game, which makes it quite flexible. The sustain part, of course, is that you have AoE. AoE is something that is quite scarce. Good AoE is quite scarce in this game. Something I noticed when I started playing. And in between Dawn's Wrath and Ice Storm, you have some of the best AoE available. That means that if a more aggressive list or even a mid-range list has taken board from you during the early to mid-game, you have an ability to come back. You've got these comeback mechanisms, and you can stabilize. And if you stabilize, and the opponent isn't very close to killing you, they're just going to lose. Because your late game win condition is so clearly defined and powerful, they just can't come back.
Yeah,
So
I'd have to
comeback,
agree with that.
Sustain, clear win con removal.
Yeah, and with that, I think also another aspect of Control Mage that's so good is all the draw it gets. There's so much draw in this deck that it really fuels all the things you were talking about. It fuels the removal. It makes sure that when you hit turns 10 and 11 and 12, you have your win condition. So I feel like that's really strong. I want to give you a quick story. I don't know if you saw this video. I posted it last night, but I was playing a guy yesterday on stream, and he had a burglar, and I had a 50-50 to kill it with an Ashlander, and it missed. And I was like, oh god, I'm so dead. Like, there's literally no way I can win this unless my opponent just throws everything into that same lane and lets me Dawn's Wrath the next turn. And he proceeds, next turn he goes, Nahagaliv and the purple 3/3 that when it dies it gives a 3/3 in addition to the burglar all in one lane. I'm just like, all right, Dawn's Wrath, we got a game.
GG.
Yeah, and I was down like 38-11 at that point. Like, it was over. And I was able to come all the way back and win it off that. So, yeah, Dawn's Wrath can be so good. I would say, and we're going to get into this more when we talk about Control Mage, but you really have to know the removal cards they have so you are not playing into them.
Yeah, absolutely.
How about, there's one more list I want to talk about, and that's the list that Justin has made really popular, which I call the Moneybag Scout list.
The dollar sign.
Yeah, the $ Scout list. Where do we put this? Because it's an interesting deck where it is sort of a late game control deck, but it has so much tempo. It feels really mid-rangey also.
I think that's part of what makes Justin's list. His approach to Scout very interesting. I think Otomonga was commenting on some of the final games in a tournament that happened just recently, where Justin and TDP ended up in the finals. And he was also surprised by Justin bringing this ramp deck, which is normally about, accelerating, cheating the curve, and starting to slam these big threats. Mm-hmm. And that's your way of counter pressuring your opponent with a deck that is actually kind of tempo based.
Yeah.
It's a ramp list, but it's looking to get tempo as well. Now, his list, I've played it a lot. This season, it kept me in top 10 for most of the season, as a matter of fact. Mm-hmm. And to me, its big difference, say, when compared to Control Mage, is that Control Mage looks to cycle a lot, use its removal and AoE spells to control the board. Justin's list focuses on using minions to do that.
Right.
And also very clever usage of the lanes to try and channel your opponent into a particular lane to abuse lethal minions and Chola Cerebra, of course.
Yep.
I love the Scout list. It I think has some weaknesses. It can have clunky hands sometimes early.
Yeah.
And you can just get snowballed early, really hard. but it also has ways to stabilize. So even those games, it's not. I'm not saying that hey, every aggro list is going to roll over because it's just simply not true.
Mm,
A skilled scout player will stabilize, and then you're in trouble.
yeah.
The other problem it has is against a very late game sort of control, like control mage. I
Yep.
would say the control mage is definitely favored there. Um, so it sits in between, which is both good and bad, right? It really preys on mid-range lists that are trying to play a value game because they just can't outvalue the scout in that regard. And it also preys on aggro lists that don't manage to close the game effectively before they run out of cards. But against heavy control, it's going to struggle. Like Spellsword control mage,
Yeah.
it's going to give Scout rank a tough time.
It's kind of interesting because it can do well against Control Mage if it gets the right hands, right?
Yep.
So for instance, if you can get a Nahagaliv out on, say, turn 5, Control Mage looks at that and says, I don't know what to do. There's nothing I can do with this card. I am taking 7 to the face repeatedly and probably losing. And the same thing with Iron Atronach. If it can somehow get that out on, say, turn 8, 2 turns before a Manacora can come down, it's basically hoping for a Dawn's Wrath, or that's it. And so it can be kind of scary. Like, as a Control Mage player, it's funny. I always think when I enter this game, I'm like, okay, this is a good matchup for me. I think I'm going to be okay. Unless this happens. And then every now and then they'll be like, turn 4, Elixir into Nahagaliv. And you're like, what? No! How? I can't do anything now. And you just die.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, those cards obviously going to give Mage difficulty. I find that as I said, I played Scout a lot in High Legend this season, and the games against Control Mage that I won normally included playing Nahagaliv at one point,
Yeah.
or sometimes getting the action knock out, or you can try and counter the Mage by outvaluing him. So what you do is you try and play your minions in such a way that you know whatever removal they have access to is going to make them play off curve and inefficient.
Gotcha.
And then what you can do is you can get the control mage down to less cards than they normally have. And that means they have less answers. And then try and be the beatdown. You pick a spot and go beatdown and hope.
Yeah, I think you have to play the beatdown role. I don't think,
sure.
even though you have cards like Iron Atronach at the end of the curve that look even better than the Control Mage's cards, Manacora is just too good because it removes your bomb and puts a bomb on the board simultaneously, and that's the real destructive thing.
Exactly.
And then, of course, it has Tazcad.
Yeah,
I mean, that dude's amazing.
You can be the beatdown. That's a fact. You certainly can be. But it is, I would certainly favor the mage in that matchup.
So let's talk real quick then about these archetypes and which ones you think generally beat the other. So when you're facing aggro versus a mid-range, are you tending to favor the mid-range in that one?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, and then mid-range control, it's supposed to be control beating mid-range because mid-range usually can't be fast enough.
Right, or they're not slow enough, right? That's how it normally goes. If you want to beat someone, either your list has to be quite a bit faster or it needs to be slower.
And then when you have control versus aggro, this to me is kind of coin flippy. It's like if the aggro can get it off fast enough, it can beat the control mage, but if it can't, control mage has a pretty... not control mage. Control in general has a pretty easy time with an aggro list if it can't close it out fast enough.
Yeah, it comes down to how many of the appropriate answers you have early to the aggro list.
Right.
Basically, that's what it comes down to. Because you got all the tools to stabilize if you can just survive.
Okay.
And different archetypes can survive more effectively than others, control archetypes. So.
All right, so hopefully you guys found this archetype talk to be useful, especially if you're newer to this game or newer to card games in general. And the lists that I showed were not the best lists. A lot of them were missing plenty of cards, so you can go to the Team Prophecy Meta Snapshot and get links to some of the top players in the game playing the list that we were talking about. That's a great resource, and find some lists there. So I wanted to move on to a really tough question that I've been avoiding because I don't want to talk about it because then more people know about it, and then it's a larger problem. But I feel like this problem is exploding, and that's the bug that's happening on the ladder. Have you run into this, Ancient Silence?
I ran into it once or twice. Because I wasn't playing a lot of Control Mage, I haven't been on the receiving end of this
Okay.
as many times
See.
as others have.
So let me
But,
talk
I'm
about
not
this
aware.
bug, what it is, then, real quick. For those of you who don't know, boy, now you know. Don't do it. But here's the bug: that within the first, I believe it's 4 turns of the game, if you decide to concede the game, you do not take a loss. Essentially, you lose no rating points if you're in Legend, and your opponent does not get any rating points for the win. So the real problem here is we just talked about archetypes and how which archetype beats another. So let's say you're playing a mid-range deck as your archetype, and you run into a control deck. You can just go, boy, that's a rough matchup for me. I'll just concede and move on to the
Yeah,
next
or
one.
I don't like my opening hand. Well, I'll just
Yeah.
concede.
Oh yeah, let's say you're an aggro deck and you don't get the nut draw. You just go, I mean, this deck wins when it gets the nut draw, so screw that. I'm just going to concede this. And it's a huge problem in my opinion. I know a lot of people haven't run into it too much, but my buddy Jake was playing top 10 Legend, and he said he had like 4 out of 7 games people did that to him. It's real hard to climb when the deck your deck preys upon just concedes when it runs into you. It's pretty ridiculous.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's become more public, this bug, right? In the past, what has it been? 4, 5, 6 days, maybe.
Yeah.
Uh,
Eh,
First, it was mentioned, and when people heard of it, they were like, "No, this can't be right. It just how can this even be allowed to happen?"
Yeah.
But it's coming out more and more on Reddit and people on Discord running into this way. People are chain conceding whenever they see a bad matchup or have
Yeah.
an unfair.
The problem for me is that people. It's a really tough spot where it's like, should you do it or should you not? So let's look at it on the one side. I think you absolutely shouldn't because it's essentially cheating. But on the flip side, you could say it like this: it's a part of the game. If everyone I'm running into is doing this to me, I would be a fool not to do this and then just lose all my bad matchups and not get to play my good matchups. So why would I like basically intentionally tank my own rating and not do this when everyone else is doing it to me? That's sort of that argument. And then the other side is, don't do this because this is like basically cheating. Where do you fall in on this?
You know, this is the internet. There's no way you're going to prevent people from exploiting loopholes in the system.
Right.
There are always going to be people who exploit it. There is something I would like to say, and I've noticed this. I've been observing very closely how the ranking system works in Legend, at least.
Mm.
And I will say this to these guys who are chain conceding like this: you may not be losing a rank, and your opponent may not be gaining one, but be warned. One thing I've noticed is the ability to sustain, like actually, rather maintain a position on the Legend level ladder relies heavily on your win rate over a window period of games. Okay. So, although you're not dropping a rank, make no mistake, it is still logged as a loss. It is going to damage your win rate. So, what's going to happen down the road here is that you're going to get to a particular spot and you're going to not be able to play for a day or, say, want to camp the spot, maybe even. And what's going to happen is you're going to come back in 24 hours, you're going to have dropped like 10 ranks. And why is this? Well, because your win rate wasn't high enough to start with because you've been conceding these matches.
Yeah. I don't. I wonder if it's going to become an even bigger problem next season. I have to assume sometime in the middle of the season it'll be fixed. And then is that just going to crush you? Like, it's going to be like, oh, I was 20. And then the system is like, okay, now we're correctly analyzing your wins, losses. We notice there's this huge disparity. And then you lose your next game. It's like, boo, shit. It like overcorrects your MMR and crushes you. So I think that's a real thing you need to think about for this next season. Obviously, this season that ends today when we're recording, it's not going to be an issue. But I'm really curious to see if you get severely punished. I don't think they're going to throw out bans or anything like that. I think that would be an error, just because it's a dev issue that
Yeah.
hasn't really been public. But I think there could be an MMR crushing that happens.
Yeah, I mean, as far as I understand, the devs are aware of this now, and I mean, the guys who are behind this game are no fools. They have a lot of experience, and you
Yeah.
know, sometimes things like this happen, and I'm pretty sure they're going to try and address this as fast as they possibly can.
Yeah, I actually talked to Maricon yesterday, and I asked him if I could quote him and everything, and he said that this is a bug that they were recently made aware of. Because it's such a new bug to them, it won't be handled, by the end of this season for sure, and they're working on it, and it is a high priority for them. But they are aware of it, so be aware. They are now fully aware of it. I want to throw an analogy out here. See if you agree with this. And a lot of you guys are not sports fans, so this might not resonate. But I view this kind of like 1990s baseball. So in 1990s baseball, what happened is you had a couple people start messing around with steroids and doing really well and saying to their buddies, hey man, I'm doing this thing, steroids. It is not illegal in the game. You should do this. And a huge segment of the sport did this, and all these new records were created. And they're all tainted now because people look at this and go, oh my goodness, that was a steroids guy, that was a steroids guy. So yes, they had these accomplishments, but now they're not getting into the Hall of Fame. People look at them differently. It's tainted the other players who were in that era. Like, why did you only hit 30 home runs, you chump? That guy over there hit 70. And it just messes everything up. So if you're doing this, you're messing everything up for other people, and you're messing it up for yourselves. There's a person who came on my stream yesterday and said, oh, we just got paired. I'm not playing against a control mage. He's a scout. The deck my deck preys upon, and conceded the game turn 1. I will always remember that person as kind of a scumbag who cheated the system. I'm not going to call him out by name on a podcast, but that person, no matter how good that person gets, if he becomes the world champion, I'll always think, yeah, he's kind of a cheater. He's kind of a cheater scumbag who abused the system.
Yeah, I think it's basically the the burden of choice is on the person who decides to do this. Just I'm sure they're aware, or if they aren't aware, they are now that it basically screws things up for other people. If that's your choice and that's what you want to do, well, fine. But it's on you.
Yeah.
It's on you.
Having said that, I think by far the best deck to ladder with if you want to cheat is Justin Scout deck. It pretty much beats everything but Mage. You just concede all the Mage matchups and then continue to crush face.
Yeah. If you're gonna go with that strategy, I suppose you could do that. Yeah.
Here's the other thing: if you're gonna go with this strategy, you better make top 10. Like, this guy was only 70. I was like, you're 70 and you're cheating, dude. If you're gonna cheat, you better be amazing. Don't be cheating and then not be amazing.
Or you're gonna have to hope to cheat a lot to get into higher ranks like that.
Yeah.
Because really, as I said, look, I don't have all the details or anything of exactly the algorithm that's used for ranking in Legend, but I can tell you one thing: your win rate over a window period of games is really important.
Yeah.
So if you are going to do that, don't be surprised if it takes you quite a while to climb, and
Yep.
if you struggle to hold a high spot
Yeah.
because of doing so.
And if you get crushed somehow, if Direwolf Games comes out and says we are going to do soft bans for 3 days, or we're going to strip rating points, don't complain. Like, you're doing something wrong. Let's be real. You know it. Like, there's a little part of you at least that says, maybe we shouldn't do this. And then there's a bigger part that says, shut up. We want to be higher rated. That's fine, but you're taking a gamble. All right, well, let's move on from this. It's a really distasteful thing. It has a big asterisk on season 1, and we're just going to move on from that. Like, seriously, in a year from now, someone's like, I was number 3 Legend season 1. I'm going to be like, so? That doesn't even count for me. like, that season didn't exist. That bug was too prominent to have that actually exist. All right, let's talk about Control Mage. Control Mage, so Archer was the scourge of the ladder for quite a while. Now I feel like it's Control Mage. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Control Mage is very popular, especially in the higher legend rankings. Very popular.
I think one of
Alongside,
the reasons is because Scout got so big, and this really does a good job of handling Scout.
I think that's part of it. I think it's part of it. The other part is just, Mage has such a great variety of tools to deal with different styles. That, eventually once the lists became more refined, it just started to creep up to the top spot, just naturally.
Mm-hmm. I think what happened was Scout brought people to the list and to really push out Scout. And then after that happened, people were like, wait a second. I don't ever have to leave this list. I can just refine it a little bit. Oh, there's more aggro? I'll throw in some Pillaging Tribunes and get some more health. Oh, there's a lot of control? All right, bye, Pillaging Tribune. I don't need you. I'll put in, maybe the Prophecy Weaver and whatever his name is, Manakara, the 11 cost guy that steals the
Mirok, yeah.
Yeah, Mirok. You just have so many options within Control Mage to combat whatever you need to combat. So I'm going to say it right now. I'm playing in a tournament tomorrow where you get a 10-card sideboard. A 10-card sideboard, to me, screams Control Mage. Like, oh, you know what you're facing? You can easily beat them the next 2 games because you're Control Mage.
Yeah, it takes. I think it takes well. So it has a good infrastructure to support tech choices catering to specific matchups. Certainly.
Yeah, I really enjoyed how consistent it is and how you can, like you said, you basically have answers for every type of deck. You may not always draw them in time, in the right order, and you still can lose games because of this, but it's the only deck I found in this game where I feel like I should win every game no matter what the matchup is. Like, there's no matchup where I throw my hands up and go, well, I could just concede this one to save time. It's always like, well, if I draw these cards, I'm still going to win this.
Yeah, it's. I would argue that it's favored in most matchups.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so good. It's just so flexible. So a question then becomes: there's quite a few expensive cards in the list. Do you feel like there's a budget version of this list, or do you feel like if you can't build most of these legendaries that you should just probably steer clear of it for now and then kind of build up as you go?
I think that you could make some adjustments to it, but it's the efficiency of the list is going to only take you up to a certain point. Now, that certain point might be, and again, it's one of the great things about Control Mage that we haven't mentioned before, is that it's quite a skill-intensive list to play. Okay?
Yeah.
So if you really understand the game and you understand matchups, you can play a list that doesn't run every single one of the AAA grade cards that you see in the most expensive Control Mage list, and you can win games consistently.
Yep.
To actually build a more budget version list of it also requires some understanding, because you could, for example, take out Daggerfall Mages, which are not in every list, but it's really serves an interesting purpose for Control Mage. You could bring in Telvannis.
And the list I have on screen is 2 Daggerfall Mage, 1 Telvanni Arcanist. That's not by choice. That's because I don't have a third Daggerfall Mage.
Right.
It used to be 1 Daggerfall Mage, 2 Telvanni, and I crafted a second Daggerfall.
And like if you don't have 3 peddlers, you could get away with playing 2 and maybe opening up a flex slot somewhere else.
Yeah, I would go so far as to say Peddler is a card you don't have to have. You can build the deck slightly differently. Peddler is such a high skill card. I still struggle with Peddler. Peddler is the card in the deck that tempts me to make bad plays. I'll be like, I don't need to spend 2 spells here, but if I do, I could trigger Peddler. And then I do it, and I'm like, what the hell was that? Why did I do that? All because of this damn Peddler draw?
Yeah, it's not a card that you just slam it down and you're like, well, I need to just immediately get value off of this, or I just play it on curve. You certainly don't.
Yeah, yeah.
It's
It's a late
it's a
game card.
card that with experience you learn to use it when you need to,
Yes,
and
exactly.
then it's very strong.
It's a card I've replaced several times and brought back several times, and I think you could go without it. But it's only an epic, so I wouldn't worry too much. I'd say one of the big problem spots is Dawn's Wrath. This is a legendary, and you might think like I already have Ice Storm. Do I really need Dawn's Wrath? The answer is yes. Yes, you do. It's a fantastic card.
Yes, it's if you look at Mage's removal suite, right? There are certain HP thresholds. So anything small normally gets removed by a fireball.
Hmm.
Anything a little bit larger gets hit by a lightning bolt. If there's a board full of sort of 3 and 4 drops, it gets ice stormed. But now, what happens when you're facing a lane with awkwardly statted minions
Yeah.
and have HPs that break those thresholds, and your opponent has decided to commit to a lane? Dawn's Wrath is just massive value. It's
Yeah.
essential to the list, I think. Two of them.
I agree. I had 0 the first time I built it and lost more games than I won. I went up to 1, and that helped. 2 has really been a great number because Javelin sort of does what Dawn's Wrath does more inefficiently. Like, you can often go Javelin one turn, Ice Storm the next turn, and handle that. But sometimes you just can't. Like the game I described earlier where he went Burglar and Nahagaliv in the same lane. You can't even Javelin Nahagaliv. Like, Dawn's Wrath is your premier answer to that card. So not having it is very troubling.
Yeah, I mean, the difference between Javelin, I mean, there are obvious differences, but the big difference between Javelin and Dawn's Wrath, for example, is that having a card like Dawn's Wrath in your deck that can take care of an entire lane, as opposed to Javelin that's a single target removal, is that you can make more advanced level reads in your
Yeah.
opponent's game plan over the next 2 turns, and you can bait him
Yep.
into playing into a hard Dawn's Wrath. And
Yes.
the value swing alone from doing that at the right time can win you a game.
Yeah.
Just like that.
It's my favorite thing to do is to bait my opponent into good Dawn's Wrath, and it's so frustrating when they don't do it, and they're like, "Listen, man, this is not my first rodeo. I've played against Control Mage. I'm not a fool." And they, put it in another lane when it's worse for them, and you're like, "No, no, that's a bad play unless I have a Dawn's Wrath, but you know I probably do. How dare you make the right play, you jerk."
Yeah, it's a key card. It's key. You
Yeah.
need to have that.
I'd say one card that you could probably replace is Nakreen, and this is the Nakreen Dragon Priest. When you play him, you draw a card, and the next card you play is free, and he's a 5/5. I didn't have him in my list for a long time, and he feels like he's not that amazing. You're like, okay, I already have a lot of card draw. Playing a card for free and getting a 5/5, it's like a Soul Rust Marshal. But what's the big time key with Nakreen that really makes him so valuable? What's the one play where you're like, this is the
Wow.
reason. This is the reason why he's baller.
Well, there are a few, right?
Okay, sure.
Nakreen into Manticora on 10.
Yep. But you can already play a Manticore, so all you're getting is
You
one more
can,
body, which is
but
great.
you're drawing as well, right?
Yes. Don't get me
Right.
wrong, that's
So-
great. I love doing that. But there's a play that just
Oh my goodness.
makes it
So
bananas.
Nakreen also into Odahviing early is
That's
fantastic.
yes. That's
Like,
the
mind-blowingly
reason.
good.
That'll win you, I'd say, 2 out of every 10 games, that combo. I didn't realize it would happen as often it does. Because you go so late with this game and you draw so many cards, you will see this combo regularly.
Yep.
I didn't believe that was the case. I made Nakreen just because I was struggling with the list, and my playtest partners were like, listen, you can't make evaluations until you have Nakreen. He's that important. I was like, no, he's not. And he is. Oh my goodness. Odahviing on turn 10 when they're not expecting it, because they're like, I've got 2 more turns, I'm fine, and then, boom, the board is gone,
Draw
and
a
they
card.
lose.
Clear the board, develop a 5/5 and a 10/10.
Yeah. It's just crazy. It's basically the game is now over. Sorry about that. It is a crazy swing, and because of that, it's funny because I want to say you don't have to have Nakreen, and you don't. But I will say it's a win. It's a win out of every 10 games you're losing out on.
Yeah.
And you may win that game anyway, but it's an auto win when that happens. And yeah, so I'd say you could probably replace him. Manticore is a card. It's only an epic. If you want to play this deck, I say you need 3. What do you say?
Yep, agreed.
Yeah, it's just
Manticore is
that
just
good.
too strong. It's too good for what it does to ignore it. You just, if you want to play a list like this, you craft it. If you want to play Spell Sword Control, you craft Manticores as well. It's just a
Yes.
fantastic card for late game deck.
And that's I feel really safe recommending crafting a couple Dawn's Wrath, a couple Manicoras, Odahviing, because any control deck is pretty much doing this. The 2 major control decks are Spell Sword Control and Mage Control, and they both need these cards. So if you like control, you should be working up towards this spot.
I agree.
A card that I think you could do without is Erin. She's really good. A 5/5 for 5, so she comes in pretty early. She gets a spell back, which is amazing. Your spells cost 1 less. But I don't feel like she's a make it or break it. You don't have this card, you can't play this deck kind of card. You can slot something else in there, maybe even a taunt, maybe a draw card, maybe a removal card. There's a lot of things you could put in that spot, even though, don't get me wrong, she's fantastic. What do you think? Can you play this deck without her? That's a tough call.
I just think that although one may look at the card and say, well, it is a legendary, it doesn't look, fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I think that Erin is, I think she's a very, how shall I put this? She's just a really versatile card that performs different functions at different points in the game for you. And that if I had the option and I were serious about playing Control Mage, it's a card I'd grab.
Yeah.
I wouldn't like to run this list as a starter, but if you are on a budget, you could probably get away with it. But there will be times where you're going to miss that clutch draw that she gives you. And the fact that she reduces your spells for actually by 1, that can be really incredible on the right turn.
Yes.
So
I've done some crazy things with her. Like on turn 5, playing her, getting the Firebolt back that I played earlier, playing 3 Firebolts to take out all the aggressive characters against an aggro deck, and then just smile and say, that's it. Like I just won off Erin.
And in a control match, if you happen to get one of your hard removal spells, or even just a crushing blowback or something like that, it gives you leverage that you didn't have before, and it allows you to continue manipulating the state of the game. She's great, and personally, I would say it's kind of a must-have.
You are the worst, sir. You're like, every one of those legends must craft. I'm gonna have to agree to some extent. Like, to me, it's playable without Arian, without Nakarine. You could probably play it with 1 Dawn's Wrath. You could play it with 2 Manicores. You could play it without Odahviing. But it takes a substantial hit. Like, you're going to play it and go, why do people say Control Mage is so good? It's okay, but it's not that good. But you're losing power cards. Like, this deck, more than a lot of other decks, the legendaries add so much critical power because you're trying to outlast. If you outlast and then get to that point and don't have the bombs that you're supposed to have, it becomes a lot harder.
Yeah, absolutely.
A card you can slot in there is Miraak. A lot of people have Miraak in anyway. If you're in top 10 legendary right now, you have Miraak for that control matchup, the mirror. I've slipped down past that, and so I don't see quite as many mirrors. A lot more aggro, so Miraak has been out of the deck right now, but that's certainly a card that could slot in for, say, Nakarine, maybe for a 3rd Manacora. But it's a list where it's hard to say there's a budget version that's really strong. On the plus side, a lot of the really good cards are epics. I feel like Daggerfall Mage is easily replaceable, and so what you're left with is 1 Erin, 2 Dawn's Wrath, Nakarine, and Odahviing. That's not that many legends. What are we looking at? 5 must play legends? That's not so bad.
It's not so bad. No, it's not. And if you've been playing for, a month or so, and you've played a bit of Arena, you've probably gathered a substantial amount of the commons and rares anyway. And then quite a few of these epics are great cards that you want in your collection anyway, as is the same with some of the legendaries that we've discussed. So it's not, I don't think it's ridiculously expensive. I think a lot of the cards are probably in your collection already, and the others are worth crafting.
So the last thing I want to talk about with the deck itself is how you play it. And this is one of the things that's really weird about this deck that is hard to get a handle on when you first start. But you play it quite reactionary. There'll be a couple moments where you do actually kind of rush your opponent down, but it's very rare. Generally, you don't swing face and pop any runes until quite late in the game. And it can be really disconcerting if you've come from, say, an archer list where you're really trying to push, or a spellsword token list where you're trying to push. Moving to control mage is a whole nother animal where it really is just about controlling the board, reacting to what they're doing on the board with your minions, with your spells, and not until really late game saying, yeah, okay, it's time to close this thing out.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. It's reactionary, of course. Many control decks tend to be quite reactionary. Another tricky thing I notice is picking your moments when you actually want to draw. There are moments where you're going to be looking at a board with maybe one or two minions that the opponent has, and you make the choice not to deal with them immediately, but to cycle.
Sure.
Because you have that experience in that matchup, and you know, how do I win this game in the long run?
Right.
If I expend these resources right now, what's going to happen is I'm not going to have the answers I need later. What am I looking for down the line? And can I maybe let him hit me once, draw me a card, and then I will hit him with a big ice storm in the following turn, or an efficient tempo removal turn, right? Something like that. There are very many tricky aspects.
That is one of the big time keys, is to play into your mass removal spells, taking damage to the face. Because remember this, taking damage to the face in this game is a good thing. Your life is a resource, and it's such a valuable one because it gives you cards. You're like, okay, really? You're going to keep hitting me in the face? Awesome. Give me more of the answers that I was looking for. I really need that ice storm. You just hit me 3 times, and now I got an ice storm. Thanks, man. Appreciate that. So it's very interesting. I feel like it's the Muhammad Ali rope-a-dope deck, where you're like, all right, you kind of stick your face out there, hit me a little bit, just a little bit, give me a card. Okay, now dodge away and kill a guy. Okay, hit me again. It's just a really fascinating deck to play from that aspect.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, the key to the rope-a-dope, of course, was that what you're doing is you're trying to get the opponent to expend all of their energy, right? And once their energy is gone, it's also much easier to land a critical punch.
Exactly.
And that's kind of what Control Mage tries to do.
Very much
and
so.
It's got the tools to stabilize. It's got the sustain. So it can afford to take those risks. But be warned, if you are not experienced with the list, you are going to need to take risks at times, and each one of those risks is going to have to be a calculated risk.
Yep.
And if you make the wrong decision at the wrong time, a single decision might lose you the game.
There was a game yesterday on stream where I decided that this was the moment I was going to push. It was early because I had the tools on the board and I had the tools in hand. I thought I could close it out earlier against maybe a scout deck or something before it got really rolling. And it did not happen, and I lost terribly. Like, it was just a bloodbath after that. It was like, I gave my opponent a bunch of cards, he used them to destroy my board, and then wreck my face. And I was like, yep, nope, that was a mistake. I should not have gone in yet. I should have been more patient. And it can be really hard, by the way, to ladder with this deck. The amount of patience you have to show, because you get so few games in, compared to, say, Spellsword Token, I probably got maybe 5 to 7 more games in every hour than I would with a Control Mage deck, and it can be tough sometimes. You get impatient. You're like, oh, I got a stranglehold. I should just push and win this damn thing. It's going on forever, and that impatience will often lose you games. So if you're starting to tilt, back away from this deck. You need to have all your faculties, all your patience when you're playing this thing.
Yeah, it's not a as I like to refer to them. It's not a ladder grinder deck where you're trying to just grind out a good ratio of wins to losses in the shortest amount of time.
Yep.
That's not what this list is for.
Yeah.
This kind of list is for consistency, and if you're focused and concentrated when you play this list, it's super good for climbing, especially in higher ranks. High legend as well.
Yeah. You know what's really bad at, though? Is when your opponents always concede when it's a bad matchup for them. It makes it really hard to climb, actually.
Feels bad, man. It feels really bad.
All right, so we've talked about how amazing this list is, and I agree. I think it's great. There's a reason I play it. What counters this list? And this is really tough. Is there a list or two that you think really does a good job at countering it?
Okay, so I have a couple of interesting observations that I've made, right? I would recommend to everyone else who's new to the game or even experienced, you should go and check out the good players in the game who stream this game. There are quite a few of them, right? And so from watching carefully what's been going on, I've seen some things, okay? So from some of the more experienced control mage players, I have heard them complain that they can sometimes struggle against Archer.
Yeah, for sure. If Archer triple Jarls you, it's the worst feeling in the world.
Right. If Archer gets a just slightly above average curve going and is able to refuel almost on curve or one turn or two after the 6 mana spot with a Jarl, they can beat control mage.
Yeah,
that's the thing.
Sure. For sure.
Okay, so they definitely struggle a little bit with Archer, but it is still dependent on the Archer's draws and their experience of the matchup, because Archer can also just as easily lose that matchup by literally getting grinded out, right? The mage just takes everything you got, and then eventually you're sitting there, you're not drawing your Jarls, you're sitting with 2 cards in hand, you can't do much direct damage, and it's just the game just slowly ends for you.
Yeah.
That's horrible. Okay, the other thing, interesting. So a while back, I was watching Dovahkiin, and gotta love Dova. He's always trying out new lists. He's a really good player. And he was getting into this last gasp Wisp Mother Assassin deck.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, I've got a point here. Don't worry. And what we noticed is at one point, Blackfall came onto the stream, and Blackfall, for those of you who don't know, hit rank 1 multiple times this season with Control Mage. He's a respected Control Mage player.
For sure.
And they had a little show match series, okay? Because Dova's objective was to build a list that kind of counters Control Mage.
Mm-hmm.
And this is how it played out. Blackfall struggled to win a single match against that list.
Interesting.
Okay, so now, this could be for a variety of reasons, right? Draws, getting unlucky, all kinds of things like this. But what was apparent is that Control Mage struggles against sticky board states.
Yep.
I'll give you an example. A card like Deshaun Avenger, which is quite commonly run in agility-based decks. It's not fun for a mage to clear that.
Nope.
Often you're going to have to hit it with an Ice Storm, and then you're going to have to hit it with a Crushing Blow later, or have it trade itself into one of your guards, or something like that to get rid of it. Mm-hmm. Now, if you have a board with 2 or 3 of these sticky minions, you're starting to create situations where mage has to inefficiently use resources. Yep. And in a sense, you start outvaluing the mage.
Yep, I totally agree. Did you see Delude's deck that he played? Where he doesn't have Wisp Mother, but he has Supreme Atromancer to really be able to close it out.
Exactly. So my point here is that sticky board states give mage trouble.
Yep.
Pressure, okay. The other thing is you've got to try and make their turns as inefficient as possible. For example, you don't develop a Blood Dragon on 5. Say you're playing a Blood Dragon in your deck, right? You don't develop it on 5 because, well, a Javelin fits nicely and they can just jab it and move on. You play it on 6.
Yeah.
Right? When you have something else already developed. So now they have to say, oh crap, well, now I've got to float a mana to jab this Blood Dragon. I have to, though. And that leaves one unit that isn't dealt with for the turn. And that can then build up into the kind of pressure that can can put the mage in very awkward positions.
Yep.
Uh, so it's partly about picking the right kind of minions. It's also partly about understanding what makes life difficult for the control mage deck.
Yeah.
You've got to know your enemy.
Yep,
you know?
for sure. I have a list up here that Delude piloted to something like top 4. And it has, like you're talking about, it has some sticky minions in it. It has some prophecy in it with like the Black Sap Protector. And then it has closing power, right? So it has 3 Cliff Racers to try to close it out before they can stabilize fully. It has 3 Supreme Atromancers for more closing. It has Tazcat, and so it has all these ways to say, it looks like you've stabilized. You have not, my friend. You think you have, but I've got piles of damage coming out of the hand with lightning bolts as well. And so it becomes this really interesting problem for the control mage. Oftentimes, its whole goal is to stabilize, knowing in the back of its head, like, well, there's a Tazcat waiting. So 6 is not enough. 7 is where I'm stable. But if they go Cliff Racer, Tazcat, Atromancer, there was no way to stabilize through that.
Exactly. I mean, charge creatures in particular make life difficult for mage.
Yeah.
So good for you, control mage player. I know you've got a lightning bolt in your hand, but guess what? My Cliff Racer has already dealt 4 damage to your face. And now you're going to waste some of your closing power because you have to on this thing. But the damage is done.
Yep.
So Tazcats, Cliff Racers, these kinds of things, it's going to give mage trouble because they can't stop it before it does the damage. You know, the damage is done, and then it's there on them to respond to it and continue to control the board and work toward their win condition.
Yeah, and that's why Tazcat is such a beast, because he comes in, he does the damage, and then you remove him, and he leaves behind a 4/4 that can't be killed with like anything but lightning bolt. Oh, he is really tough to deal with. Tazcat is the card that, as a control mage player, I fear the most. Supreme Atromancer, whatever. I've got ways to handle him. Tazcat is the one where I'm like, oh god, this is like 3 removal cards to kill 1 freaking card.
Exactly.
A deck I want to throw out there as also good with mage is the super greedy control version of Spell Sword. I was playing this for a little while because it's so good against control mage, and it's just so fun to be able to be like, oh, you have 3 Manicoras and an Odoving? I'll see you that, and throw in a Nahagaliv, 2 Blood Magic Lords, a Mirac, some Night Shadows. Let's do this thing.
Yeah. Absolutely. Spell Sword control is something that is quite rarely seen. The reason for that is because Spell Sword control's early game is quite lacking.
I don't know if I would go that far. I think its early game is pretty decent. The problem is it doesn't have the removal. So it's kind of like the Scout deck without all the ramp pieces. That's kind of how I view it. Like, its early game is okay, its late game is great, but it can't like ramp into it super fast, and it doesn't have as much early game as some of the other decks. And since it's minion based, if it doesn't draw them, it just loses.
Well, that's kind of what I mean, right?
Yeah, but it still has good stuff like, you know, Eastmarch Crusader's not bad, the Spell Sword, Deadly Draugr.
Eastmarch is not really a 3-drop, right?
It's like a 5-drop.
Yeah, I mean,
Fine,
sometimes
I'll say
playing
Young
on
Mammoth.
3.
Young Mammoth is great.
Yeah. I mean, you've got some good options there, but where that list really starts to shine is in the late game. It really, sure. I mean, and I must just add, there are some cards here that are being overlooked for Spell Sword control as well. Cards like Halfingar Marauder.
Oh, interesting.
That card, even in a control list, it can just provide this edge that your opponent doesn't expect.
Sure.
And it comes out on 5, and you can use to snowball your board a little bit if you've managed to take control early. So I think there's a lot of potential. Actually, I'm glad you mentioned this archetype timing, because I think I'd love to see more people experimenting with Spell Sword control. I think it's good.
I think it's a different animal. Control Mage seems easier to play for me because you just have answers always, whereas this is much more sort of planning and playing into outs and trying to control the board with minions that you might not draw. I feel like this list is harder to build and refine and maybe harder to play as well.
You know, I think that if you really compare the core ideas behind a spell sword control list and a mage control list, both of them are essentially trying to do the same thing. They have some cards that overlap, okay, and obviously they share certain removal options. The differences, though, are quite important. Spell sword control doesn't have access to something like an Ice Storm, for example. You're relying a little bit more on minions to control the board, but whereas a control mage has these great comeback AoEs now. Yellow, of course, does have Dawn's Wrath, but it is 8 mana.
Yep.
It's quite expensive, so you're a little bit more reliant on minions. The other thing, and this is why I still say Control Mage for me is the premier control deck, the draw.
Yes. The draw is so different. Oh my goodness.
It's so different.
Yeah. And that's why I say I think this deck is so much harder to play, because the decisions you make are final decisions. It's like, I have 2 removal pieces. This may be it. I'm not going to draw 9 more cards over the next 4 turns. I'm going to draw 4. I may not hit another removal piece. Whereas with Mage, you can be a little bit less particular with your removal pieces because you know you're just going to keep drawing them.
Actually, you've got Peddlers, Schemers, you've got Aaron, which you can kind of consider a draw as well.
Yeah.
You know, you've got so many options for draw and Mage, and that cycle ability is just something Spell Sword Control doesn't have.
Yeah.
But they make up for it in other ways, and I would agree with you that if you build Spell Sword Control in a particular way, you will beat Mage, in a sense, at their own game.
Yeah.
In a late game value grind, you'll beat them. The problem is, that kind of Spell Sword Control is going to lose to a whole lot of other lists out there.
Yeah. And I found that to be the case. I tried to ladder with it over a weekend. I left my stream, I think I was like 58. I returned to my stream 458. And people were like, what the hell happened? I'm like, I tried to Spell Sword Control list. I'm sure it's good, but I lost like every game with it. So, yeah, I'm not going to be playing it anymore for now. I also think it's an interesting possibility to try to build it like Control Mage with Immolating Blast. And so you have like 2 Immolating Blast, 2 Dawn's Wrath, and Immolating Blast in some ways is a better Ice Storm. In some ways it's a worse Ice Storm, and in some ways it's a better Ice Storm, depending on how your deck is being built. And I think that's intriguing, and I feel like people haven't really explored that fully. Not that I've seen anyway.
I think I've run into it, surprisingly, once or twice. I just think that the variance on Immolating Blast being good and being bad is so great that I would prefer not to run it. Actually, I would just try and a slightly different strategy for maintaining control at that point of the game.
Sure. I think it depends on the meta. If you're playing a meta in which small cards are ruling, like say Spell Sword tokens, if that becomes the meta at some point, I think Immolating Blast is great for a meta like that. But for a meta where it's Control Mage and it's big late game stuff, Immolating Blast becomes much worse because, like you said, then it's a really high variance. It's like I either hit the Brutal Ashlander or the Mirak, and that's so different. Like one wins the game, one loses the game, and a card in that metagame becomes a real liability.
You know, the thing is that at high levels, high-level competition, high-level ladder play, what those players are looking for is consistency.
Yeah, for sure.
And Immolating Blast is just not consistent enough.
Yep. All right. Well, I think that's a good summary of Control Mage, what it does, how to beat it. But there was some interesting news this week. We had our first round of nerfs in the open beta period. I missed all the closed beta nerfs. They're not allowed to talk about them, so I have no information about them. But we saw some pretty big nerfs. I want to start with the Murkwater Savage. I was actually looking for him in the 2-hole, and I was like, where is he? How come I can't find him? That was the nerf. Get with
the schedule, Tiny. Get with the schedule, man.
He is 3 now, and that's a huge difference, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, especially when you consider what kind of cards you have in the 3 slot when you're playing agility, right?
Oh my goodness, yeah. They're just
Yeah,
ridiculous. They're so good. Like
yeah,
Nimble Ally doesn't see play, and he's usually a 4/4 lethal. Like
and
that's how good
he's
their 3-drop is.
exactly. But of course, the Mac Daddy of 3 drops, almost in the game, is Kinsman.
Oh yeah, yeah. The House
Um,
Kinsman. He dies and he wrecks you because he fuels the soul rest by dying.
yep, and you can sack him later in the game for that extra damage over guards. You know, it's that card is crazy
Yeah,
good.
I really like this nerf. Not in a vacuum. I think in a vacuum I don't like the nerf, but because it's in the faction with Soul Rest Marshal, it just made it too easy to trigger Soul Rest Marshal when you had both Murkwater Savage and Kinsman in the same faction. It's two cards that just really feed into making it so you never miss with your Marshal, and I don't like that. I like the tension of Soul Rest Marshal being a gamble. Will I have enough life or not? And I feel like Savage takes away the gamble, so I like the nerf because of that. What are your thoughts on the nerf?
um, I think it's slightly heavy-handed, to be honest with you.
I think it's very heavy-handed.
It's yeah. I'm trying to be polite here. I say slightly heavy-handed. Look, there was an interesting discussion I overheard a little while back. CVH was talking to Admirable about how they feel about agility, right? And made some important points there about agility as a class, right? That its identity is a little bit all over the place.
Sure.
They have good cards, but many of them support all sorts of different game plans, right, and win conditions.
Okay,
That's
interesting.
And Murkwater Savage is this thing that is just so easy to proc it early,
Yeah.
but it plays so well with almost any of the strategies that Green wants to follow. And if you don't answer that thing, I mean, I think it's part of the reason why Crushing Blow was run so often was,
Oh yeah.
I need to be able to deal with Murkwater Savage
Yep.
ASAP, you know? On the other hand, when we look at the slot that it's competing in now, the card's just too slow.
Yeah, I
Shocking
agree.
as it might sound to an inexperienced player, that one cost that it's more expensive almost makes it unplayable.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you think about a mammoth, a woolly mammoth is a 3-drop 4/4. That would mean you'd have to hit twice with the savage to make him equal just what the mammoth looks like normally, and that's really not going to happen.
No, I think there were actually two interesting suggestions I heard for other ways to have dealt with Murkwater Savage. One was to make it only grow when goblins are played.
Hmm.
So
Okay.
that down the road it becomes like a goblin synergy.
Sure,
thing,
that would work.
which is kind of cool. Kind of
Yeah.
like that.
Yep, I like that.
The other suggestion was, well, maybe you could have made it a 2-mana 1/1, which
Yeah.
I like a bit more.
Yep.
I think that it still allows it to be fast enough in a sense. Not as good, obviously, as it was,
Right.
but at least not too slow to actually
Yeah.
be considered in the list.
Yep. I think that would be reasonable. I think another interesting choice would have been to make it a 2-drop 2/1 that only gains attack, and so there's
Kind of
plenty
like
of
the
easy ways
Undertaker
to kill him.
nerf, right?
So.
Kind of like the Undertaker nerf in Hearthstone.
Yeah, exactly. So he's pretty easy to handle, so he's never going to get totally out of control, but he could still be a really useful tool in triggering Soul Rest because you get that quick early game punch, but you know he's going to die right away to anything. So he has like this fairness about him, despite helping you fuel that game plan.
Yeah, I think that was also pretty reasonable.
So I think I actually like all of those better than what they did do. But I will say, while some people seem to be upset that he's now a dead card, I'm fine with him just not triggering Soul Rest. There was too much that triggered Soul Rest. Any of the nerfs I would have been fine with. I'm actually fine with this one as well.
Yeah, early Snowball Savage was so brutal. It just made managing your HP very, very difficult. Between that and Kinsman, especially Savage into Kinsman, into Murkwater Shaman.
Oh,
You
yeah.
know,
Right.
that kind of curve, it just wrecks almost anyone.
Exactly.
It's insane.
And it's funny
So,
because you said this and other people said this. That's essentially a dead card now. And it's fine. Just put it on the list of all the other dead cards, right? It's not like it's the only dead card in the game. It is always
right.
weird, though, when a staple becomes a dead card.
It is weird. And again, I have to agree with something I heard Admirable mention before. One of the beautiful things about digital card games, unlike physical card games, is that you have the ability down the road to revisit
Yeah,
the
for
way
sure.
you've designed a card, you decided to limit its potential. And, maybe down the road, they do rethink how they want Murkwater Savage to fit in the design space of the game.
Yep.
And I would be fine with that as well.
Yep.
But for now, the big thing that it's done is it has forced lists that considered it to be core to adapt,
Yeah.
which is also great. That's
Yep.
what we want to see, right?
Yeah, for sure. Let's move to the other nerf, and that's a nerf slash buff, which is really interesting. You don't see that very often. But the Soul Rest Marshal gets nerfed from if you don't know this card, I'm not sure what you're doing. But he's a 5-drop green 4/4. When he comes into play, if you have more health than your opponent, the next card you play will cost, and it used to be 6 less, which meant turn 4 you could go pop my elixir, drop Soul Rest Marshal, boom, Jarl, turn 4. Huge tempo swing, refilling your hand. A lot of times that was just ball game. Now they've reduced him to be only 5 less, which just slows that combo down by 1 turn. Do you think that's enough? Like, is that enough to slow that combo by 1, or was that nerf not really what you thought needed to be done?
I think initially, prior to the actual nerfs, I was having a discussion with someone, and what my suggestion was okay, let's let Soul Rest Marshal maybe reduce the cost of the next card played by 4.
Yeah, I like that too.
Okay, so then what you would have is it wouldn't be so devastating and so early in the game where you have this tempo play that it's incredibly difficult to, never mind just dealing with it, coming back to win.
Yeah.
From that play, it was crazy at 6.
Yes.
Now I think they've struck a sort of middle ground between what I was thinking with the reduced cost by 5, and I think it's fine. One thing that I see a lot in card games is that people are very quick to cry about nerfs, but there is a world where when you nerf everything that's really powerful, the game starts to feel diluted. You want every class or faction or attribute to have unfair things that it can do.
Sure.
Soul Rest Marshal was just too unfair. And it still has the potential to be very unfair when you go Soul Rest into 5-drop or something like that,
Yes.
But I think it's fun.
It's also
There are
not
ways to play.
unbeatable. Like in the last tournament I played in, I ended up losing in the first round. The first game, bad things happened. The next 2 games, my opponent went. The first one, turn 4, Soul Rest card, and then the next game he went Soul Rest card. But I was able to win one of those. I lost in the end because I lost to one of them, and it's really hard. But I did win one of those, and it's interesting. I feel like you need to have Soul Rest be powerful because, in my opinion, and maybe I'm wrong here, he sort of defines Green. Like, this is Green's primary game plan is, like, we're going to get a health advantage, and we're going to do Soul Rest. And you know that, and I know that, and it's on you to stop me from doing this. And if you're not going to try, then you're going to get burned. And you may not try because you know my game plan is not to try to stop it, but to try to react to it. But you need to have a game plan going in. And so if he becomes too weak, then that huge identity gets removed from the class.
Yeah, well, as I already mentioned, and there are other people who feel the same way, that Green already, they don't have a focused direction. They just have a crap load of amazing cards.
Yeah, they really
and
do.
what's happened is that Soul Rest Marshal is just such a powerful card in a variety of archetypes that include green that
Yeah.
it's come to be known as, holy crap, I'm playing against a deck with green in it. Expect Marshall. There are
Yeah.
decks that run green that don't run Marshall, by the way, and that
Sure.
are also really good.
Yep.
So, yeah, I think I like having that kind of card in the game. And I think it was necessary to tone it down a
Yeah.
little bit. And I think we need a little bit more time to see if it was maybe not strong enough of a nerf. But
Yeah.
personally,
I think what's going to be really interesting about this nerf is the buff that comes with it. And that's that it used to be that it only reduced the next creature. Now it reduces any card. And so there's this really intriguing window of possibilities, like especially in something like pairing green with yellow, playing monk, and being able to do things like Soul Rest Marshal into Fervor. Like, Fervor tends to be a card that you're taking a huge tempo loss to play it because you either have a big enough board that you're going to be fine, or you feel like you have enough coming that you can take this one turn tempo loss. And to be able to play Divine Fervor with a 4/4 buy that becomes a 5/5 on the same turn, it can be really, really strong. And I'm sure there's plenty of other combos like that that I think will be. It's going to be interesting that there's a lot of room for exploration there now.
I absolutely agree with you. Absolutely.
Well,
Um,
I think we're gonna have to close it out here. This episode has run fairly long. I think it's been a really good episode. We'll talk next time about where Archer has reacted to these nerfs. We'll give it another week to really fall into place, and then talk about potentially things like Bone Colossus got a nerf where it changed it from saying undead to just skeletons, and then it changed it back. But the devs have come out and said we are making that change, and the reason is to be able to make more interesting tribal affiliations. And so we'll talk about that next time, how that might affect the game and how interesting that could be. Thank you so much for coming on, Ancient Silence. I really appreciate it. I had a great time. Hopefully the listeners did. And where can people find you on the internet? What are you up to?
Whew, well, at the moment, I'm just finding my feet with Team Prophecy, but I will start contributing there very soon, and I will try and keep people up to date on how to find me.
Okay. Do you have a Twitter or a YouTube or anything like that?
Not related to Elder Scrolls Legends.
Gotcha. Okay.
But look for me in the team. I'm hoping to add something worthwhile.
Okay, sounds good. And you can find me at Twitch TV/Tiny Grimes, 12 p.m. to 4 p.m. Pacific, Monday through Fridays. I'll link my YouTube in the show notes. I put funny games in there. All kinds of stuff is in my YouTube. And I do want to say we have our Patreon page for the podcast, and this has become more important. So I have the show on iTunes, and I have it on a free place, but the show has gained popularity, and I ran out of bandwidth fairly late in the month. It will reset, but it's going to run out really quickly this month. And so essentially, I need to be paying about $120 a year to be able to make the podcast continue appearing on iTunes. So if this is something that interests you specifically, it's an even greater reason to become a Patreon supporter. Even the $1 level is great. I always announce new Patreon supporters, and there's all kinds of interesting things for you as a Patreon supporter. So if you want to be a part of the show, if you want to join the family, get over there, support this podcast, and help me bring it to iTunes long term. It's something I'm really thinking about. Do I have the money to just $120 every year just put towards this? And the problem is not just do I. It's the negotiations with family members who are going, wait, what? I thought you were going to try to make like a tiny scrap of money doing this. Now you're paying a fortune to do this? What is wrong with you? Wait, and did you just buy a bunch of packs too? What's going on here? So it can be kind of dicey to make all that happen. So if you want to give us some support, go for it. Please do. Much appreciated. And I'll put a link in the show notes. So once again, Ancient Silence, thanks so much for coming by. It was really great having you.
Thanks for having me, Tanya. It's really a pleasure. Look forward to seeing more great stuff from you in future as well.
And same to you, my friend. And we will see you next week on another edition of The Secrets of the Scroll.